Ba-dum-bum-bum. Bum-bum-bum-bum-bum. Bum-bum-bum-bum-bum-bum. Hey, John, come on in here. Pull up a seat, unless you're driving your car, in which case, don't pull up a chair. Nothing good can come from that. Hey, Andy. Hey, Navin. Mark, good to see you. You have come to the right place if you were hoping for morning coffee with Scott Adams. This is the place, and it's time now for the simultaneous sip. Grab your mug, your cup, your glass, your stein, your chalice, if you will. Fill it with your favorite liquid. I like coffee. And join me now for the simultaneous sip. Oh, it's good. Let us start with the favorite, my favorite story of the day, and I know it's your favorite too. So yesterday, poor Jim Acosta, famous critic of President Trump, turned into the nation's piñata, thanks to a video in which it was such an amazing own goal that I actually laughed and cried when I saw the president's tweet about it, as you did too, I'm sure. And so for those few of you who haven't seen it, Jim Acosta did a video segment where he was standing next to a border wall that is essentially the steel slat kind that's pretty much exactly what the president is suggesting. And he mocks that he doesn't see any kind of crisis, and he's right there on the border standing next to this really tall wall. No crisis next to the wall. Now, I think Jim Acosta thought he was making a point that was against the president. But what he was really doing was standing in front of his own goal and driving the ball into the back of the net. Because the president's point is that there's no crisis when you have a wall. And he was literally standing in front of the wall, let's call it a slat steel barrier, whatever you want. And so, of course, the internet had fun with it all day long. And President Trump had maybe the most perfect tweet. I don't know, you might even say it's one for the ages. You know, I write humor for a living. So, you know, I appreciate a well-crafted, if you could call it a joke, but well-crafted humor. So the president's tweet, he just tweets the video, and the only comment he made was, "Dear Diary." Now, I'm a professional, and I could not have written that better. There was something so deliciously dismissive about it, while still being tongue-in-cheek, while still acknowledging how hard he was winning, the president in this specific case. And he didn't overplay it. It would have been so easy to overplay that hand. You know, he could have said, you know, big dope, Jim Acosta doesn't know that he's standing in front of a wall. You think of all the ways that tweet could have just been, you know, too much thumb on the scale. But instead, the president, and I've said this from the beginning, his comic sensibilities are extraordinary. So he pulls it back all the way to the simplest little lightest touch. Because it was sort of like, you ever watch a kung fu movie where, you know, the kung fu master goes pop, 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 to the bad guy, and the bad guy's still standing, and then the kung fu master goes poop and pushes him over dead, because it was just, you know, the last little push is all it took. Well, with the president going, "Dear Diary," that was like the last little push. You already killed yourself. I'll just push you over, just a little bit. That's all it takes. So I literally stood in my kitchen after I read that, and tears were like falling down on the kitchen counter, and I had to like clean up the tears of laughter. And I know a lot of you have the same experience. All right, let's go to our next big story. I like to maintain my credibility wherever that's possible, by being critical of both sides or complimenting both sides of the political world when appropriate. Here's a case of that. There's a viral story going around this morning. Everybody's sending it to me about CNN apparently contacted a local station in San Diego called KUSI. And according to KUSI, their own reporting, they say that CNN asked them for some assistance in getting somebody to talk about the border. And when CNN was informed, apparently in this conversation, that the border barrier, or wall, if you will, works according to the reporting at this station, then this station says that CNN decided not to use their their resources or talk to their people because it didn't fit the narrative. I call bullshit on this story. Now, here's the parts I believe. I believe CNN contacted them. I believe CNN asked them for help. And I believe that when they explained that, they were sort of pro-wall, that I do believe that CNN changed their mind. What is not in evidence is why. And here's the context I'm going to add that is not in the story. And if you don't add this context, it could be misleading. And here's the context. When a producer contacts somebody and says, can we do this or can we do that, it's always exploratory, but it's also dependent upon other stories they're writing, about other uses for CNN's resources, etc. So what is not in evidence is why CNN decided not to pursue this. The assumption is mind reading, right? So KUSI's reporting is essentially mind reading. They're saying we told them something they didn't want to hear and then they went away, as if that's why they went away. Now that might actually be entirely true, but, and this is important, it's not in evidence. The primary claim is not in evidence. We only know the facts. Facts are, they talked about doing something and then they decided not to. That's all we know. Now, I know what you're saying. You're saying, but Scott, CNN is biased. You know that they can't do a story that's contrary to their claims. That might be true, but that's not in evidence for the reason that they backed out. So I'm trying to be consistent. Remember, I criticize almost every day CNN for trying to read other people's minds and say, oh, the president has evil intentions. So if I don't do it in this case, I'm not being consistent. It's entirely true, or it's entirely possible that KUSI's reporting about the mental state of CNN could be true, but it's not in evidence. Okay. Let me ask you a question. When my stepson died of a opioid overdose that included fentanyl, I likened it to the number of people who died in the country to the number of U.S. Military deaths in Viet Nam. And now I'm seeing that widely used by the president and in other reporting. So that the comparison of the deaths by fentanyl in particular being compared to the number of U.S. military deaths in Vietnam. Did I start that? So that's my question to you, because I actually don't know. I feel like I was the first one who ever said that, because I remember the thought process. I remember thinking, how can I size this? And I came up with that Vietnam thing. But it's entirely possible other people did it as well. So, yeah. Now, if it's true, now a few people are saying no. It's been a thing our whole lives. If you have another source for that, let's say a Twitter source, somebody who made that analogy first, please send it to me, or that comparison first, because I would like to know whether or not I was influential. The reason I'm asking that is that one of the ways I can test the effectiveness of my influence is by choices of words that I use that get used by other people. So it's like a little fingerprint. So when I came up with that Viet Nam comparison, I was attempting to create a fingerprint that if that became popular, I would say, okay, people are listening to me because I see my fingerprint in the way they're talking about it. But since I can't confirm, I'm the only person who ever said that, I can't confirm it's really a fingerprint. So if you can help me on that, that'd be great. Let's talk about, let's talk about border security. There are some surprising things coming out of this border conversation. And here's the most surprising thing and contrarian thing you're ever going to hear. Are you ready? This border debate is bringing the country together. Now that's the opposite of what you think, right? Don't you think that this whole border thing is driving the country apart? Well, emotionally, it is. On an emotional level, it probably is driving the country apart because it's just another reason to fight. But let me ask you this. How much do you understand about the real border situation and the real challenges and the real pluses and minuses of walls versus fences versus electronic means? How much do you know now that you didn't know even a year ago about how drugs come across, how important it is, the details? Think about how much you have learned about the border and the challenge. Personally, I went from not knowing much of anything to knowing quite a bit, right? And I would say that that's not just common to one side of the argument. Both sides are being deeply educated on a topic of high interest to the country. Now, what happens when people are deeply educated? They start here and here, completely opposing forces. But as the two forces become educated, what is happening? Have you noticed that the proposed solutions are growing together? All right? So the public's opinion of what is practical and not practical started here and is starting to come together. Now, if you looked at the language they use, maybe you wouldn't notice it, because the Democrats are saying walls don't work, walls don't work, and Republicans are saying walls totally work, they totally work. So on the surface, you'd say, well, those are kind of opposites. But if you look under the hood just a little bit, you can see that people say things like, such as, well, it's clear that we don't need the same solution for every stretch of the border. That wasn't always the case. When we started this conversation, I would say Republicans would have said, yeah, we just need a wall. Wall it up. When we started this conversation, I think Republicans would have said, these walls are going to stop the drugs. It's really going to make a big difference. But we've now learned that by far the vast majority of drugs come through the legal points of entry. They're in cars, hidden in cars and stuff. We also know that there are technologies that could help us detect it, and that those are being purchased. So I don't know exactly the technologies, but in addition to sniffing dogs, they've got things that can, look through things, maybe some kind of X-ray sort of imaging thing. I don't know exactly what the technologies are. We know more about drones. We know more about children being locked up. We know more about everything. And the more you know, the closer your opinions become, because the crazy stuff is getting tossed out one by one. Now, what the people on the left are hearing is that where walls are put up, the Border Patrol says they work, and the towns that are subject to those walls say they work. And that seems quite consistent, doesn't it? Doesn't it seem to you that the story is quite consistent? That where there's a wall, it has, at least for that area, has made a big difference. Not even a small difference, but just a big difference. Now, we're also becoming somewhat experts about what kind of a wall makes sense. We've learned that seeing through the wall matters. We've learned that some walls, even the metal ones, can be sawed. We've learned about ladders and everything else. And we've learned about tunnels. We've learned about the cartel controlling parts of the border. So I think in this weird way, and certainly this was nobody's intention, but I think the country is actually coming together on what I call the engineering questions, the questions of what actually could work. So I don't think even the government has a real difference in what works. So right now the government is locked in nothing but a political, contest. So the president needs this wall for political reasons, or this barrier, whatever he wants to call it. The Democrats need to thwart him, again, for just political reasons. But I think the public has largely come together. Imagine if you went to somebody on the other side of the debate from wherever you were. Let's say you were pro-wall from the beginning. If you were to have a private conversation with somebody who was not pro-wall, somebody who was an anti-Trumper, and you say, okay, nobody's listening, it's just you and it's just me. Can we agree that border security matters? And you'll both say, well, yeah, all right? There's so few people who say open borders. Any Democrat you put in a room with just you, a friend of yours, is going to say, yeah, of course border security matters. And then you say, would you agree with the proposition that you would use different solutions in different parts of the border? And then you would both say, well, yeah, duh, obviously. And then you'd say, would you agree that the people who are most capable of deciding would be a combination of the Border Patrol, who have experience, plus engineers that they work with that tell them what's practical and what isn't? Would you say that's the best way to approach it? They would say yes. So you'd be in perfect agreement. And then you say, let's talk about the budget. Would you agree that $5 billion is really nothing compared to the budget? And again, your Democrat will say, yeah, I mean, $5 billion is real money, but in terms of the country and the budget, it actually is kind of trivial. So if you put the harshest Republican and the harshest Democrat in a room and nobody else was watching and they didn't ever have to explain what they said, they would never have to, nobody would ever see their opinion, it's just the two of you, you would pretty much precisely agree on what is the problem and what needs to be done. Now, this works both ways. That let's say the Democrat says to you, okay, Republican, you said you want this wall and one of the reasons is to stop drugs coming across. Would you agree that all the fentanyl that you need to kill every person in the United States could fit inside this Kleenex box? Now, if the Republican doesn't agree, you just show them a link and say, okay, here's a picture of somebody holding it in their hand. In fact, Sanjay Gupta did this on CNN the other day. He held up a package almost just this size and talked about it being worth $30 million. Now, if you can make $30 million from a package this size, let me show you how this package can beat a wall. Are you ready? This will be a very technical demonstration. Watch. Oh, look, it just went over the wall. All you need is somebody on the other side to catch it, right? Or you could throw it over the wall, and then, if you're a serious drug mule, you could probably find a way to crawl over the wall yourself as well. So, would the Republican and the Democrat come to an agreement that the drug cartels are pretty clever, and if you make it harder to use one way to get to the United States, they'll just use another way? Because again, it's this big. There's no wall that's going to stop something this big from getting from 10 feet over there to 10 feet over there. That's just not a thing, right? Secondly, or not secondly, you might talk about crime. Now you go into the room, the Democrat and the Republican, and you've been arguing for a year about the impact of crime. The Republican says crime is growing across the border. The Democrat says, well, I agree that there's some crime coming across the border, so we're in agreement on that, but the crime rate is lower for immigrants of all types, legal and illegal, than the people who are already here. They're actually lowering the crime rate. To which the Republican says, I don't care about the rate if I'm dead. It doesn't matter that they come from a group of people with low crime. It matters that they robbed my house, or that they sold drugs, or they murdered somebody. So would you agree, Democrat, that if you could take the crime rate down to 0 simply by following our laws, that would be a good idea? It doesn't matter what the rate is. It just matters that you have a way to bring it down. Would you agree that bringing down the number of crimes, not just the rate, but the raw number of crimes is a good thing? And would you agree that lots of people are getting raped trying to come across the border, etc.? In very short order, if you presented it that way, you'd find that the Republican and the Democrat, as long as nobody else was watching and they didn't have to answer to anybody afterwards, would both say, okay, I get you, the crime rate is not that high, but that's not really the important thing. The important thing is if there is crime and it is substantial, and if we're talking about murder and rape, any amount is substantial. There's no such thing as a little bit of rape being okay, right? That's not a thing. Nobody in the room is going to say, well, a little bit of murder, it's just not as much as the average, so a little bit of murder can't be that bad. Nobody's going to say that. You're going to agree that if you can do something about it, you do. It doesn't matter that the rate is lower than normal. All right, so here's my point. I believe that this debate has drawn the citizens to almost exactly the same opinion. And I didn't think that would ever be possible. And it happened through massive accidental education. So we have been massively accidentally educated about the southern border. Now, the other thing that might come up in the room with the one Democrat and the one Republican is that the one Democrat might say, hey, Republican, the big problem is people coming in from the airports and overstaying their visas. By far, that's much bigger in terms of numbers. And the Republican would say, you're right, we should do something about that also. But wouldn't you agree we should solve all of our problems? Why would you only why would you only care about the big one that we don't really have an obvious answer for when you can solve a small one? And we have an obvious answer for that. Why wouldn't you do that? And very quickly, you end up being on exactly the same page. So it's only a political difference at this point. It's no longer legitimately a difference in opinion in the country. It's weird, but the citizens are all on the same page, or they would be if they spent 5 minutes talking to each other. All right. Let's talk about, I'm trying to decide if I want to talk about Jeff Bezos and his upcoming divorce. Given that I have, my income is largely dependent on Amazon.com treating me fairly. I got a feeling that I've got a feeling that maybe I'm going to stay away from that. But you do have to ask the question: is it a coincidence that Bezos is having these troubles? Assume there are no coincidences in the world, and that if you're the head of a major media organization and you've been attacking somebody for 3 years, and there are people within that organization who have the ability to attack back, there may not be any coincidences in the world, but I have no way to know that. All right, let me talk about climate change. Now, if you're new to me talking about climate change, I do not have an opinion whether it's a big old hoax or whether it's real. And I've been doing a deep dive over weeks where I'll take one topic at a time and try to see if I could figure it out as a non-scientist. Now, I'm not trying to look at the science, I'm just trying to understand the arguments. So my filter on this is persuasion. And I have so far determined that a fairly big number of these skeptical arguments are just complete bullshit. All right, I'll list a few, but there are others that I have not debunked in a way that is persuasive to me, but I think maybe that's possible. Likewise, there are a few things on the pro-science side that seem to be clearly bullshit, or they're presented in a way that makes them look like that, which is puzzling in itself. So that's part of the mystery. The mystery is, for someone who's legitimately on the fence, which I am, I'm legitimately on the fence, why is it that the people who are the majority of scientists can be so unpersuasive in specific parts of the argument? Not necessarily the whole argument, but why are there parts of it that are so clearly smell like BS, look like BS? I haven't figured out why. I have some hypotheses, but we'll work through it. But let me tell you, so here's today's current learning. And again, I'm begging for fact checking, because what I'm going to say next doesn't sound like it could possibly be true, but it's my understanding. So I'm going to tell you my understanding. I'm going to admit that it doesn't sound like it could possibly be true. And then you tell me what's wrong with it, because I don't know what's wrong with it. So my understanding is this, that in order to draw the graph that shows the temperature and CO2 are in lockstep, and that the current rate of increase is unprecedented, let's call that the Michael Mann hockey stick, then in order for that graph to work, they had to have enough historical data to show that the current situation is unprecedented. Okay. Now, the first question I ask is, one of the skeptics, I think it was Happer, no, it was Lindzen, I think it was Lindzen, shows the Michael Mann graph that shows that, in the recent years, the rate of increase is unprecedented. And then he says, look at their own graph. Their own graph shows that within recorded history, the rate of increase has happened before. You just look at the graph. The claim they're making that there's nothing like this rise in history is refuted by the graph that shows that rise. Now I look at it and I say to myself, what the hell? Wouldn't that be the simplest thing to either prove or disprove? If the official graph has two unprecedented changes, and one of them was much earlier in the CO2 history, in other words, there wasn't as much CO2, how could I be looking at the official graph that disproves the official graph? I don't know the answer to that. Now, it could be that the skeptic is misleading me in some way, but I'm looking at the official graph. I'm not looking at the skeptic's graph. I'm looking at the science's graph, the consensus. How do you explain that? Here's the other part that I think I understood, but there's a problem. So this morning somebody sent me a clip of a climate scientist who was debunking the various, what he called conspiracy theories against climate scientists. So he was debunking the skeptics. And he started out by talking about the so-called ClimateGate, where an email was discovered in which one of the climate scientists working with Michael Mann were trying to explain, shall we say, that's the most neutral language. They were trying to explain why their theory didn't seem to make sense given that there was some warming in the past that was not CO2 related. And the email said that one of the scientists used Michael Mann's, quote, trick to, quote, hide the decline. I guess it's the opposite. They were trying to hide the fact that some temperatures were declining in some period. And and my opinion on that is that that is a conspiracy theory, meaning that there's nothing in evidence from those emails that I find problematic. All right. If you looked at those emails and you concluded that they were illegitimate scientists doing an illegitimate thing and trying to conceal their treachery, that's not in the email. The email is the way two people who know each other talk. If I said I'm using your mathematical, if I'm emailing a friend, I don't say, "Hey friend, I use your mathematical formula to get a result." I say, "I use your trick." I use your trick to get a result. So they use the word trick. In casual conversation, it doesn't mean treachery. And they said to hide the decline, but of course that was the problem they were working on. They were trying to figure out how it could be within scientific, within the realm of science, how could you make that go away? So the Climategate thing has been completely debunked as, I think that is just a conspiracy theory. But then the scientist who was trying to debunk the skeptics went after the tree rings. Here he did not do so well. Let me give you the argument as it's presented. Again, acknowledging, and I'm going to say this as clearly as possible, I must be wrong about what I'm going to say next. So everything that comes out of my mouth in the next couple minutes has to be wrong, but it's what I'm seeing. It's what I'm seeing as the argument. And the argument goes like this, that in order for the current measurements to make sense in terms of CO2 being the driver of temperature, it has to be true in the past as well. But there was some discrepancy in the past that would have made the current theory look like it was wrong. So in Michael Mann's work, to try to explain the discrepancy, he went to proxies. And one of the proxies, actually the main proxy he used for figuring out the temperature in the past, where there was a gap in the record, was tree rings. So he used tree rings to fill in that gap, because the size of the tree rings will tell you something about the temperature, and then it all fit. Now, there were tree ring experts who debated that, which is a separate problem. The tree ring experts said, "Hey, you did it wrong." But the bigger problem is that tree rings from 1960 to the present do not track with temperature. They're not even close, they diverge. So the question is, why is it that tree rings worked in the past, but now we know for sure, at the moment, there's no question about them, that they do not track temperatures in the present. So how could they be useful in the past? Do you know what the climate expert said to explain why tree rings were good in the past, but they're no longer good in the present? He said, "We're working on that." That's part of what he said. "We're working on it," meaning they don't know. But here's the suspicious part. He said, "We can tell that the tree rings used to be good because of other proxies." So in other words, they used other temperature proxies to match the tree rings in the past to find out that they were correct in the past. What's wrong with that thinking? Here's what's wrong. If they had other accurate proxies, why did they need tree rings in the first place? The one and only reason that tree rings were used in the past is because they didn't have a better way to do it. Do you think if you wanted to measure the temperature in some past year, that your best way to do that would be to measure tree rings? If you had any better way to do that, wouldn't you use those better ways? So the scientific explanation of why tree rings used to work, but now they don't, is completely refuted by the argument about why they work. You can't say they matched the proxies in the past while also saying there were no proxies in the past worthy of using. Now again, I'm asking you to fact check me. Why don't I understand that? That's the argument that was given. And if somebody's going to miss the argument that's a terrible argument. All right, here's another terrible argument. I sent around a challenge the other day on Twitter. It was a skeptic, let's call him a skeptic, I think that's close enough, Dr. Happer. And so he was talking about the illegitimacy of the models. So the video in question was only about how the models are not good because you couldn't possibly measure this stuff. That was the basic point. And I asked people to debunk what he said, because he was pretty specific about his criticisms. And here are the debunkings that I got. People sent me to other things he said that were debunked. Think about that. I said, tell me what's wrong with this argument. And the only argument I got was there was some other unrelated thing that people said he got wrong. And there were several of them. But they weren't the point. All right? Here's the other argument. People said, but we know that he's been paid by the oil companies. All right? And therefore he's not credible because the energy companies have paid him. Now, I agree with that. I agree that if somebody is being influenced by money, you can't trust their opinion. Who else in this story is influenced by money? Every climate scientist. Every person in the story, on both sides, is apparently motivated by money. So you can't say that Happer is not credible because he gets paid or has been paid in the past by energy companies. If you're not also willing to say that money is an influence on the other side, it's either true that money influences or it's true that it doesn't. You just have to pick a side. And if you want to be compatible with science, you have to pick the side that it does influence, because that's what science will tell you. All right. There's also, I'm seeing in the news, a recent report that says the ocean is warming faster than modeled. In other words, the models were wrong and that the ocean is getting warmer much faster. This was reported as both proof of climate change and also proof that it's wrong. The same information is being presented as proof that is right and proof that is wrong. And so the proof that is right is that, hey, we told you that warming was going to get dangerous. And sure enough, it's even more dangerous than they thought. So we proved it. At the same time, the people who don't believe the models say, well, if your model wasn't even close to predicting this, have you not just disproven your models? Because the most important thing that the models could do would be to figure out what the ocean is doing, because the ocean is the biggest factor, right? By far, what happens in the ocean is going to be the thing that matters. So it can't be simultaneously true that we missed our estimates and it's much worse than we thought, while at the same time, hey, our models are dependable. They just can't both be true. Here's another one. And here you have to fact check me, but I'm hearing from skeptics that the temperatures in the United States happen to be not warming the same as the average of the globe. And coincidentally, we have the best measurement in the very place that is unique and that it's not warming. Now, what are the chances that the places we have the best measurement is also the only place that it seems like it's not getting warmer? What do the scientists say about that? First of all, I'm not entirely sure that's true, but that's the claim. What do scientists say about that? They say, well, the world does not warm up every place in the same way. The world warms up, maybe really hot over here. This place could actually get a little cooler, but on average. So you can't so here's what the scientists say. They say you can't look at one region and conclude anything. And you can't look at a handful of regions and conclude anything. If you're not looking at the whole thing, you're not really looking at the problem, because it's the average that's going up, not this place, this place, this place. All right, so let's accept that. Let's accept that the average could go up and it would be meaningless to look at a certain zone and say, well, this zone isn't like the average. That doesn't mean anything. At the same time, you go to the NASA site where they're trying to tell you all the proof of climate change. And what is one of their major proofs? They tell you that in a certain region, the Arctic, the temperatures are above average and there's more ice melting. Now, of course, the skeptics refute that, but that's not the point right now. The point right now is that one of the major claims of climate science is that you can't look at one area and say, this is telling you something. You have to look at the whole. At the same time they say you can't look at one area, because that could be an outlier, they use as one of their primary proofs, hey, look at this one area. Look at the Arctic. It's melting. Can't have it both ways. Either the Arctic is a good proxy for the rest of the world, or, like the United States, it's just an area like any other area on Earth, and you can't tell a lot from that one example. So, this is why I'm on the fence. Because it's very clear that a number of the skeptical arguments are just total tinfoil hat BS. That's obvious. But not all of them. Some of the skeptical arguments have still stood up. Yeah, and I would say that so far Tony Heller has the strongest case. So the case about the models being inaccurate, I think a lot of people have a good argument for that. And frankly, I believe the models are not accurate, which is different from saying we don't have a problem. I'm still on the fence on whether this is a big problem or not. But Tony Heller's focus is not so much on the models, but rather whether the data is being accurately collected and used in a good way on a graph, etc. So far I would say the Tony Heller skeptical argument is the strongest one. But, and there's a big but here, he also attributes intention to what he reports on. And the intention, I would argue, is not in evidence. It's mind reading. So it's one thing to say that NASA used to report this temperature, but now they report this, and that, coincidentally seemed to work in their favor. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. All right. Now here's my ultimate skepticism. The entire climate change debate comes down to the question of whether we can accurately measure the temperature of the ocean and we can measure it accurately enough historically to know that whatever we're seeing is unprecedented. Do you believe that science, with all its awesomeness, can measure the temperature of the ocean, both today and historically, at a level of precision that would be useful? Now, maybe, I'd hate to be the guy before the Wright brothers flew who said, well, there's no way, science will tell you there's no way that an airplane can fly. That's not a thing. I hate to be the guy who says that science can't do what it's going to do tomorrow. I don't want to be that guy. But I cannot wrap my head around the fact that we can measure the temperature of the ocean at all the levels that we need to and account for all the movement. Now, so here's the question I ask. How many measurements, or let's put it this way, what percentage of the ocean do we have to measure with, let's say, buoys, because satellites are really just going to do some surfacey stuff, but what percentage do we have to measure in order to be confident we've measured the ocean's temperature? Like what do you think that would be? Because I'm guessing we measure 1% of it. Would you say? Do you think that the thermometers get a direct read to something like 1% of it? Or maybe something far less? Somebody says all of it, 100%. You think that we measure 100% of the ocean? I don't think so. So the hockey stick graph correlates to the production. All right, let me ask you I don't remember if I asked you this in public before. I want to ask you the most naive question that I think is just scientifically naive, but I don't know the answer to it, and I have no sense of embarrassment. So I'm going to ask you the most naive scientific question, and here it is. The CO2 is pretty directly correlated with our industrial growth, right? With the number of cars and energy and smokestacks and how much coal we use and all that stuff. So our industrialization follows, the line of CO2 fairly directly. Isn't it also true that the industrial age directly adds warming? In other words, when I run my fireplace, I'm not only I'm not only creating CO2 because it's a gas fireplace, but I'm also warming things. I'm directly warming things. My car engine is warm. I'm warming my house. My body is warm. Are we not directly adding heat? Somebody mentioned concrete. Isn't the amount of concrete that we're adding to the world, isn't that making a difference? Wouldn't we expect that the result of lots of activity that directly causes heat, if there were no such thing as CO2, wouldn't you still expect human activity to vastly increase the temperature? Because I'm giving off heat all day long. And if I had not been born, I wouldn't be. Where's that heat going? Now, the reason somebody's saying it's insignificant, but you would also think that about CO2, wouldn't you? I mean, it's such a trace little gas. The fact that your common sense says, well, maybe that's not enough, I don't know. I'm adding quite a bit of heat. Take right now, for example, my entire house is full of heat. It's got to go somewhere, right? Doesn't it go somewhere? So I guess I don't know the science well enough to know why the actual direct heat isn't the obvious explanation of why things are getting warmer. All right, and again, I'm not making a claim. This will be taken out of context probably, and somebody will say, you're claiming it's because your fireplace is making the world warmer. I'm not claiming that. I'm just wondering, why doesn't it? It's just a question of curiosity. All right. Have I talked about everything I wanted to talk about? Oh, one of the skeptical claims that I don't agree with is that we can't predict hurricanes even 2 days in advance, the direction of hurricanes. That's one of the great skeptical claims. If you can't predict a hurricane 2 days in advance, how can you predict, the climate, decades in advance? I think that's probably a bad example. It might be persuasive, but I'm not sure that the logic of it holds, because a hurricane is a single event, and the climate is the average of lots of events. And I would think that it doesn't seem to me completely inconsistent that you would have trouble figuring out a hurricane because it's an individual event, but you still might be able to figure out average temperatures if you could measure that stuff. So I'm not sure that's the strongest argument. All right, let's talk about RPOS. RPOS, and I think you know who I'm talking about, 29-year-old new member of Congress. I'm trying not to talk about her as much because I don't like giving energy to racists, but there is something interesting happening that I can't not mention. So it turns out that the Democrats are starting to turn against RPOS because she's sort of making them look bad. She's not playing well with the rest. And I thought to myself, a while back I thought, Fox News and the the other conservative sites, they need to stop talking about her if they don't want to boost her power. And I thought, why are they boosting her signal? You know, of course, I was doing it at the same time, but in my context, I talk about persuasion, so I have a better reason to do it. And I thought, that's probably a mistake if what you want is more conservative Republican policies. The last thing you should be doing is boosting her signal. And then I realized that what Fox News did is, by boosting her signal, in part, you know, obviously CNN and the others are boosting it too, but they weaponized her and then they turned her loose inside the Democratic Party to cannibalize it from the inside. That what should have been a perfectly good case by the Democrats has turned into an unworkable proposition thanks to her. And I have to ask myself, did Fox News know what they were doing? Did they know that by weaponizing the least, let's say the least, the least sellable argument, by trying to help the Democrats embrace her, they would be embracing the least sellable propositions? And maybe that was just sort of a genius level strategy. I don't know. But the point is that imagine the Democrats without RPOS. Imagine that most of the energy and the reporting about Democrats was about how they're the sane people compared to this crazy, impulsive President Trump. Now, if Democrats simply ran a pretty good candidate, you know, somebody who meets their demographic and whatever other interests, but is also just capable, you know, pretty good campaigner, as long as that person seemed sane and not a racist, they probably have pretty good luck against the president because he's been painted in such a negative light. But because they have to defend now why they're the party of RPOS. Oh, RPOS is, she used to be called AOC, but when she went full racist, I renamed her to RPOS. The R is for racist. POS does not stand for point of sale, so you can do the math. So I think she may be succeeding in completely ruining the Democrats' chances of ever having a president, at least in the next number of years. So I have to point that out, that she's become a festering wound in the Democrat. Does festering wounds make it? Yeah, RPOS, the festering wound within the Democratic Party. Pelosi is still the power player, and we'll see where that goes. All right, that's enough for now, and I'm going to talk to you all later.